Alrighty. Now it should be working. I am so sorry about that, guys. I am so sorry. We had a flub stream there, but the people responsible have been sacked, and the Swedish moose, is no more. And if you got that reference, you're an awesome person. Now, I'm here with Tunisgrad today. I'm filling in for Marshall. He's not feeling too well. He had to crush some mini enjoyers last weekend, and really took a lot out of him. He went at it with his all. He put all his energy into that, and I'm informed that some people did in fact start crying. It was ugly, but it needed to be done. The many people were put in their place. Kriegsspiel reigns supreme in its rightful spot, and so that convention was a great success for the IKS, I would say. And because of that, though, I need to fill in today for Coffee, Kegs, and Kriegsspiel. So I've decided to talk a little bit about the battle I ran yesterday on the Battle of Brandywine. A little scenario where the idea was to have a rearguard action, though, as we'll talk about later, that didn't really pan out. And I want to also talk a fair bit about the map that you're seeing right now on the screen that all these beautiful pieces are on that Damon made, but the map is custom made for us by a guy named Tunisgrad. He's a master umpire candidate here at the IKS, and he happens to be with us today, and he's going to tell us a bit about how he made this map, as well as we'll discuss the game itself. So, Tunis, would you mind introducing yourself for everybody?
Yeah, hello. This is Tunis. I've been with the IKS now for a few months. Really excited about umpiring stuff because at the end of the day, the umpire team never loses. So, but also making maps too. The map we used 2 weeks ago for the Bull Run game, was so beautiful. I originally was not a huge fan of it. My original philosophy was, Kriegsspiel should be played on an old map that was made. It was made by some gentleman with a quill on, with a candle that, So that I think was put to rest. Seeing the amazing map that was done, and here it is.
Let me switch to the to your
Oh
screen
yes.
here. Yeah, let me show you guys what he's seeing. Just give me a second here. And okay, now they should be able to see what you're telling us about.
Yeah, so the Bull Run map, I know many of you guys probably saw that stream or participated in the battle. I also played in the battle. That was my first live game as a player. And the map felt so cinematic. It felt so real. It actually felt like you were hovering over the battlefield looking at the action. And so I searched high and low for how this map was made, what program it was on. It was made forever ago by a now defunct game company. So that is forever dead. But I think a lot of the processes, a lot of the same feel can be made through Photoshop. And that's what I set out to do for the Brandywine map. And this is the map that came out of that. It was made entirely in Photoshop. I would say 95% was original. Some stuff like the buildings, I borrowed from various sources, all open source and free. And so that was that was an interesting process trying to get that right. And so you should be able to see it here. This was based on this map, which Carter selected as sort of the basis for what this battle would be. This isn't the entirety of the Brandywine battlefield, but this was going to be what the battle was focused on yesterday.
Yeah, and so the idea with yesterday's battle was we were going to play. Brandywine, of course, was this major engagement in the Revolutionary War. It lasted, I believe, somebody was telling me, 11 hours. And so we wanted to play not the entire Battle of Brandywine, because our Kriegspiels on Open Saturday can never get that far. We wanted to play the most important part of the battle, and that was when a British flanking attack hit the American rear. And Washington had to make a critical decision about when and how to evacuate his army because he had been outflanked, he was outnumbered, and he was outmatched by the British forces arrayed in front of him. And so the idea of this engagement, of course, I didn't tell the players this from the bat. I wanted to let them kind of figure that out as the battle progressed. The idea was to see whether or not our George Washington could have the same presence of mind, the same prescience to withdraw and make that withdrawal successful. Not a scenario you see often in the IKS, especially in Open Saturdays. And so it was an experiment, and I'd say that the experiment went relatively well, though there's definitely some things that I could do in the future. But this is the part of that battlefield where the most important part of the fighting is, when the British flank attack hit an area around what is called the Birmingham Meeting House. And so that's why this map showing that area, as well as the part of the battlefield that Washington had to withdraw through, I selected this as the basis for our game. And so, Tunis, I'm wondering, so of course this map looks very different, right, in terms of the style to your map. How did you go about actually replicating all these features on your map that you made for the battle?
Sure, yeah, I'll talk about that for a bit. So the secret that I used, and the secret that I think makes creating battle maps so much easier than it seems, is patterns and layer masks. And I'll explain what that means. So let's just take kind of a small little area. This is where I was umpiring down here at Chad's Ford. A lot of the action, we'll talk about that later, took place. This, of course, is the finished version, but let's talk about how I got to that. So, um, so looking at just the map, there's several features in Photoshop that you kind of need to be a little proficient with. But we're just going to create a new layer, and with this, it's going to be sort of the underlying feature of this kind of terrain. If you're talking about somewhere in the Northeast, or really most places in the United States or North America, it's going to be grass. If you're playing in Siberia or the Arctic, it's going to be snow. North Africa is going to be desert. So I am going to create just a layer of grass, and that's going to be used. It's going to be using a pattern. So with this new layer, it's basically just fill, and then you're going to fill the entire layer with one of these textures that I have, and I could probably talk about this for several hours, how to create these. I'll post them somewhere so other people can use them, but it's just going to be a huge layer of grass. And I created this, and this is sort of just what you might see if you look down on a grassy field. There's some different variants. Some grass is darker, some grass is lighter. There's going to be some shadows at play. But of course, this is not going to make for a very exciting battle. So for this layer, you want to create a layer mask. And that's going to be this button down here at the bottom right. And that's just going to create a mask. You can see this box is now completely white. Now with a layer mask, white means it's showing what's underneath. Black means it's hiding what's underneath. So you see over here on the left, you have these two colors. If you press X, it swaps it to black. And then G selects the paint bucket, and I can paint over it. And now the whole layer mask is black. So that's going to hide the pattern or reveal the pattern based on what you paint that layer mask. So I'm actually not going to do a layer mask for the grass, but the next step is going to be, let's do some water. Okay. Obviously, the Battle of Brandywine is about the Brandywine Creek, so that's going to play a big role. So for this layer, you want to create the water layer, and we're going to use this. So now, of course, the whole map is underwater. Great for a water world type scenario. So if you do the mask, again, paint bucket, so now it is totally covered up. And you want to select your brush and paint in white. Again, you have white over here. with a layer mask. White reveals, black conceals. That's, if you watch Photoshop tutorials online, that's sort of the tagline. And so you want to just go along this river, and I'm not really taking any special care here to be accurate. You're going to go along it, and as you paint, it is revealing the underlying layer of the water. And with some maps, you can make this a little bit easier by selecting the river, but this map was not great about that just because of the contrast between the river and sort of this tall grass, marshland, whatever you might want to call that. Let's just, there we go. And then for the smaller ones, I just decreased the brush size and literally did the entire thing by hand. And this is going to be real small. Of course, that doesn't need to be any great amount of accuracy there, just to sort of drive the point across. Okay, so there we go. Now we have the waterways. That might not look particularly compelling, but we're going to add to it to sort of make it a little bit more realistic. So let's hide this. Maybe keep the water. So Carter, we were talking about this earlier in the week, what this terrain might be here. And I figured this is probably like a flood area. You have the creek overflows and floods. So this is going to be overgrown weeds and grass, stuff that sees a lot of extra water, but not so much that it washes everything away. So I created a new mask, or new layer, and filled this one with sort of a tall grass texture that I created. And look at this. So because the pattern that I created is only this size, you have some seams here, but these seams are really easy to fix. You don't need to even do that when you fill in the entire layer. But if you want to, you have the spot healing brush here, you can just go over it and that fixes it. Or you can do the clone stamp tool and that paints over it. So those are a couple of options there, but you won't need to worry about that just yet. So we're going to do the exact same thing we did before. Create the layer mask, switch over the paint bucket, black hides it. So for this one, we're also going to move the layer down below the water because we want the water to stand out on top of it. So we'll move back over to our brush, increase the brush size, and we're going to paint. Remember to have the layer mask selected. We're going to paint in the tall grass. And right now I'm using a hard brush, but you can right click and do a soft brush. And that's sort of, instead of a perfect circle, it just sort of tapers off into the edges of the brush. And that's sort of what you want. Obviously when you have stuff like this, it doesn't just abruptly end. It does taper off into shorter grass or whatever the next terrain is going to be. So we're just gonna use our best Bob Ross impression and paint some very happy tall grass here. And then, let's talk about trees and see what that sort of looks like here. Okay, so here I mentioned before, you have the seam, select the layer, and then you go spot healing brush. Boom. And then that fixes that. And then if we go back to the trees, so that's going to be another layer. So we create a layer, edit, fill, and I have a couple of sets of woods here. One sort of thicker trees, and then one is sort of a less, not as thick of a forest. So we're going to select the thick one, and the whole layer is now trees. And yet again, layer mask, switch to black, cover it up. And then to your brush, you want to go ahead and just uncover the trees. And then we'll go ahead and do this. And I'm sticking pretty faithful to the map, but there were times where I thought, you know what, let's expand the forest a little bit. Just if there was a terrain feature that I didn't like, maybe it looked poorly on the map. You don't have to be, unless it's something like the Fredericksburg Stone Wall or something that is a very important part of history. You can fudge it a little bit. So this is going to be sort of the unkempt forest behind the Chad's Ford. There's really no reason to be exact at this point. Let's see what that looks like. All right. And to sort of go over this, where the seam meets like another terrain feature, you can hit Control and then left click, and it's going to select everything that you've painted in as the trees. So then with that selected, you can select the tall grass layer and delete it, and it's just going to delete the area around the selection you've made. So then it makes the trees pop a little bit more. And while I have this selected, on the finished map, I had the terrain under the trees a little bit darker, just to show, that's going to be some shadows. Obviously, the grass under the trees not going to get as much sunlight. So when you have the trees layer selected, you can go up here to Image and Adjustments, Brightness, Contrast, and move the slider up. And that is, oh, sorry, first you have to select the grass. And then Adjustments, Brightness. That's going to make it brighter, and then that's going to make it a little bit darker. So that adds a little bit of contrast to your trees. Let's talk about elevation. So elevation is a big thing in this. There's all sorts of these hills all over the place, and that's going to play a prominent role in warfare, defending certain points. For that, I used this curvature pen tool, and up here at the top, you want your first you want it to shape, and then fill. You don't want it to be filled. Stroke is going to be the color of the dashes, and then this is going to be the size of the dashes and other things. If you just set it to the default and then two here, you can just draw in the shape of the hill. I chose to go with the very top of the hill just to create, kind of a sort of the top of the hill is going to be the most prominent shape in the feature. And then if I select that, it selects the area of the top of the hill. And then I can go up here to Adjustments and make that area just a little bit brighter. So now you're adding a little bit of contrast between higher elevation and lower elevation. And then to further that, go in here to the Burn tool, and you can sort of make this area a little bit darker. The Burn tool is going to darken a selection. And then if you right click, the Dodge tool will brighten a selection. Now, those are two very important tools in Photoshop. So, there you have it. There's a little bit of a hill, and I would say the dashes I made a little bit too dark in this one. And the finished product, the dashes were a little bit lighter. And, if you want, you can take it and lower the opacity down a little bit more, and that'll hide the dashes just a little bit. So, Carter, what are you thinking about so far?
Well, I'm just thinking, right? Everybody thinks, right? When you see the map, you're like, oh my gosh, you must have spent, you know, eons on this thing. But the way you're explaining it, it seems like it's more of a paint by number kind of idea.
Yeah, yeah. It's really more tedious than like any kind of artistic genius that goes into it. I would say probably 40% of it was looking up historical information on like what is this farm called? Is this actually a hill? What is this ridge? Stuff like that, just to get like better looking maps because the map wasn't great about explaining what the what some things were.
Mm-hmm. And
So
I was wondering, right? You mentioned when you were doing stuff about the river that it wasn't the easiest to work with. What would you be looking for in a map, right, to use as your basis? What features make it easy or hard to do this process with a map?
well, basically, more of a contrast between the water and the stuff that is not water, everything else. This the So colored maps are the best thing, but um, even just a little bit of different. You see that they in the map they have the water. It's sort of like with these lines. I guess that's to denote like a flow.
Mm-hmm.
If there was just nothing there, that would be so much better because then you can just go to the tool here and select it, and you can still do that a little bit. And then you would just select the layer mask here and kind of do this. So like that would be if the whole
Okay.
thing was selected without this sort of dodgy stuff, that would make it so much easier. But because of the poor contrast between the water and the shore, it made it a little bit harder. And then with the small streams, that's almost impossible. Oh, actually, I say almost impossible, but that actually looks pretty good.
Hmm.
So your mileage may vary, but anything to make the process easier, definitely go for that. But if you can't do it, then hey, can't do it.
Very interesting. And would you say this process, of course, it seems to be working really well for our Civil War and our Brandywine map, but would you recommend this process also for perhaps more modern conflicts? Do you think that it would work for that too?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when you are making a map that's more untouched by man, if that makes sense, more out in nature,
Hmm.
that's going to be easier. If it's more of like a city, then then you do need to either go online and try to find some buildings for you to use. The buildings that I used, again, were free, and so I found them and just shrunk them down real small. Find this layer, yeah, and that's when you have these. So if it's going to be a modern day thing, you're going to have like actual highways to have. Um, you're going to have a lot of things that are maybe a little bit harder, but the same process you can still do with a modern setting, certainly. And I see that in like YouTube videos that talk about like battles and there was one that was a Battle of Carentan, and I could see the same sort of processes used making those maps that I use with these.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah. So you basically, to summarize, if I got you right, most of the trouble with making a modern map is just finding assets for the buildings and that kind of
Oh
thing.
yeah, yeah, 100%.
But the process is pretty much the same.
Yeah, I
Interesting.
mean, nature really doesn't change, over the centuries, but as civilization sort of expands, then you have to worry about buildings and highways, telephone wires. So I think one of the most difficult things for me was trying to figure out how to make these fences. You have those battlefield fences or zigzag fences, as they're called, and
Mm-hmm.
just figuring that out was just because, like, I don't know, it was so unnatural, and the way that I did it was I actually had to download. You can find all sorts of great zigzag brushes online. And so a zigzag brush is literally going to look like this, but you can
Mm.
shrink it down so far that it's tiny. And you can go into brush settings, change the spacing to where it's a little bit spaced out, and then the shape dynamics, you go to direction, and it's going to sort of line it up. So it's going to be something like that. You just got to find a workaround for it. Um, and then you can just draw a path here. Why is that not cooperating with me? Well, the final product now looks like this.
Interesting. Wow, that is
Yeah,
fascinating.
I'm sure there's a brush that looks like a road. There might be one that looks like... You're not going to get anything that looks like this, unfortunately. This is done with some isometric sprite. I think in some program they used for this. That's the look that I was originally going for. But yeah, that's going to be your main hurdle with a more modern situation.
Interesting. And so I want to, now that we've kind of got the battlefield, how to create that in our heads, I want to turn a little bit now. Just got a few minutes here towards the end of the stream to talk about the actual Battle of the Brandywine that we fought yesterday. So
Yes.
I'm going to go ahead and transition to the board now. Let's actually get it from your POV. I want you to kind of run us through what happened. I explained earlier, right, that the premise was British are pressing the Americans across the Brandywine, but really that's just a feint for them to come around from the side and take them out from the north. And so if you want to talk to us a little bit about what happened in the battle yesterday, that would be great.
Yeah, so I was primarily down here at the southern area. The battle was broken up into three different areas. You had a battlefield down here. This was Brinton's Ford, and then this was going to be the Birmingham Meeting House, where I think it was Green. Yeah, Green was holding off against the main British attack coming down with Cornwallis and Howe, a bunch of other British commanders up north. This was Kniphausen. I think his name was pronounced a few different ways, but he had mostly a Hessian force with a unit of Queen's Rangers. These are going to be American loyalists. And then he had one brigade of British foot soldiers here, the 71st Foot. And I wasn't privy to the original plan on the American side, but straight off the bat, Mad Anthony Wayne over here, he ordered a probing attack across Chad's Ford, and it just went so well that I think the colonials in the South were kind of like, oh well, let's just end the war right here. You know, this attack's going so well, let's just push across and secure independence. So, and it was going well for them. I think it was also going well for the colonials all across the battlefield in the first few turns, but you know, the dice kind of went against them and they pushed a little bit too far.
And then, of course, if you put that in the context of the bigger battle, right? What's going up at Brinton's Ford? What's going on there?
Brinton's Ford, I wasn't paying attention to as much, but I think if I recall, the British general was a little bit slower in getting across the creek and pressing his advantage against Sullivan. And so Sullivan did what he was supposed to do and held the Brits on the other side of the creek for pretty much the entire game. I mean, this was as far as the British player got when we called it. So that was an excellent delaying action, I thought, at Brinton's Ford.
Yeah.
That was also mentioned.
And then, of course, he sent reinforcements up to General Greene, who's in the far north there, who, well, you can see now,
he sent
isn't looking
the
too
Maryland
great.
forces, right?
Right. That was his. Yeah. So if you want to, I know that you weren't the umpire up there, but if you want to talk a little bit about what was going on at the Birmingham Meeting House, that would be awesome too. Get that sense.
Yeah, so Greene had, I think, just 3 or 4 blocks up here on this hill at the Birmingham Meeting House and held back a much larger British force.
Yeah, I think it was 5 blocks.
I think about an hour.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think finally, just, you know, again, the dice kind of went against him, and he was pushed back till about right here. I think we mentioned in the game that one of the commanders was wounded here, which was in almost the exact same place that the Marquis de Lafayette was wounded historically.
Lafayette. We
Was
said Lafayette was wounded there. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Washington nearly
So
got wounded, but we decided that Lafayette would instead.
right, yeah. But yeah, then once they got pushed back from the Birmingham Meeting House Hill, it was pretty much a running battle all the way back, and I think at that point we sort of knew the outcome of the battle was going to be not good for the Americans. But Green, the last action was Green bravely holding back the British advance with this Maryland block here, and unfortunately dying in the combat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the reason we decided to call it here, right, as I mentioned earlier, this was supposed to be a rearguard scenario, a realize that you're in trouble and get out scenario, and of course, it would have kind of ruined the fun if we told the Americans, yeah, you're screwed, because Washington had to figure that out historically, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, Greene fought an amazing delaying action, but the Americans only realized the trouble they were in when Washington arrived on the scene at the Birmingham Meeting House as Greene was starting to get overrun. And so all of that brilliant work that Greene had done delaying the British, the Americans could have been starting to prepare an evacuation. And instead, they were, of course, attacking across the creek.
Yeah.
And so now you've got Americans committed forward who are going to have to be extricated from that situation and then are going to have to start marching towards Philadelphia. So at that point, when we knew that the British were going to be able to start making an end run around the American rear and start cutting them off from their escape route towards Philadelphia, that's when we decided to call it. Because at that point, the Americans had failed their unknown, right? They didn't know, but had failed that objective, right? And we had some brilliant performances from some of the players, but also, right, I think, I mentioned yesterday that there was a lot of tactical genius, but there was a lack of strategic elements to it, right? So, definitely something to learn from. I could have made my briefing better, but I also think that the players could have made some better decisions. And that's what Kriegsspiel is all about, right? Is learning from your mistakes. And
yeah, I think that's definitely a debate worth having in the future. Is do you make it easy for the players, or do you leave the decisions up to them? Because in the end, if they make good decisions, but you sort of led them in that direction, it's a little bit less of a victory for them.
Yeah, it's kind of hollow. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so before we go, there was just one question that Achilles had, more to the Photoshop end of things. He was wondering if there's a way to distinguish between elevations such that a higher hill has a different appearance than a lower hill.
Yeah, so in this case, I made the highest point a little bit brighter than the next level, which was a little bit brighter than the lowest level. And so you can sort of see that at the dotted or the dashed line, areas that are darker, or the side of it that's darker, is going to be going downhill. So, that is sort of really, the answer is no. There's really no better way to do it. Bull Run map did have these lines that sort of go toward the lower elevation, and I'm still trying to figure that one out. But I think that at least to make it look as though it's higher, I just shaded them in a little bit brighter. And that was with the dodge tool.
All right. And if there's anybody else in the audience who has questions, please do leave them in the comments. I'm sure we'll be able to get to them eventually. And this definitely, if you guys want, this could be a topic that we could do another entire episode on, just how to create a map, what resources to look for, how to do that in the future as well. And I'm sure that if Tunis has anything to say about it, and if I am able to convince him, we'll be seeing more maps like this in the future, which I'm very excited for. So
certainly.
Yeah.
And feel free to ask me questions on Discord. Anybody that wants to know more.
Yeah, and he's Tunisgrad on Discord. He's in the IKS. If you look for the Master Umpire candidates, he's one of them. Hopefully he'll be a master umpire. Hopefully you'll be seeing more of his games here on the channel soon. I know he's planning to do a masterpiece game eventually. I won't spoil anything about that, mostly because I don't know anything about it. So, should be a good time. Anyhow, thank you so much, Tunis, for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me.
And for those of you watching, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next weekend with another exciting episode, next time with Marshall, the regular host, of Coffee, Kegs, and Kriegsspiel.